parliamentarians included as well, and that may lead to broader political support. There are many more examples, and I'm currently totally steeped in them, having gone through so many of the case studies. And so I'd ideally sit here and tell you for another hour about all the fantastic stuff that's been done in several of these case studies, but I don't have the time for that, obviously. So I'll just point you to, as in just headlines, to the fact that several of these systems really have created quite innovative solutions and aspects, and it's worthwhile looking at them individual for these. So, for example, the way that the Paris implementation is being done is through reviewing, monitoring progress, and then having very regular, frequent reviews of the policies in place, so that you have a moment in time every couple of years where you can actually adopt new policies if you're not on track. What's really important for the long term is, of course, that you're connecting any short-term policy decisions with where you're trying to go in the long run. So there's several instances where that has specifically been done, some kind of backcasting from this is where we're in the future, we want to get there, so we're backcasting from the future to now to help us inform our policies. And then the institutions I mentioned, with the specific example of the UK already, they also have quite a lot of potential to help with implementation. A lot of other innovative designs that I don't have the time to get into right now. And also we've seen really very interesting insights on what and the fact that and what works at the city level, where a few cities have the power to actually put laws in place, but they're also making it work through a lot of innovative ways of doing it. And one that I just particularly want to mention is there are instances, say, in Sydney and in Bogota and in Kempton, for example, 3 of the 4 case studies that we're looking at, and that where they've taken not just a look at climate, but they've actually tried to make this part of a larger future shared vision for the community and the city, to say, what is the sustainable future that we're all wanting to work towards? And by creating that shared vision and including climate aspects in it, they've actually been able to establish quite a broad political support. So I'll leave you with that. I look forward to your feedback, and I'll actually, just as my last pitch, I did have this wonderful picture towards the end, but maybe I didn't save the right version. It may be coming back. I want to thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to Claire's comment and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So we saw the dynamic all over the world, and the reference to Paris showing also that there was quite a lot of dynamic coming from there. We heard about the importance and the power of the legal framework in showing stability, trigger transformation, and possibly also ambition. We also heard how it needs more administrative structures potentially, and monitoring for performance over time, and in case of doubt, even court system interventions. So, Claire, what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, thank you. Matthias talked about the importance of political support in case these things unravel. So I just want to say, this time last year, I was in Marrakesh as part of the US delegation to the COP, where we launched the mid-century strategy from the United States government. And talk about unraveling, I don't think you can even find that long-term plan online anymore. So I do underscore the importance of political support.
I have a copy if you want.
All right, okay. So it's still worth the read. But anyway, so I'm here to say a bit about the political context of these long-term plans. And thank you again for the opportunity. My career has been really at the nexus of policy and politics. So I used to work back in the day for the Labour government in the UK, and I have to say it's wonderful to be here where the UK is an inspiring example across the world. It's been a while, I think, of late since we've been an inspiration. So in the UK and in the US, and And I love talking about governance. I've done a bit of it in my time. I was once working for the mayor of Los Angeles, the city level. I'm glad to see them in your case studies. When I was in LA, it was Mayor Villaraigosa at the time, and I was his head of delivery. And so I can attest, like, the easy part of the Paris Agreement is now over. Like, getting the agreement, I think, is the easy part. The hard part now is implementing that. And I keep hearing of this low-hanging fruit. Like, up till now, I don't think anything has felt very easy. But really, you know, what's next in line when we, you know, it's sort of deep decarbonisation. And so it is time to sort of, I think, it's good to talk about sort of the technical side of it, and obviously that's very, very important, the target, the temperature targets, the trajectories, but it's good also to sort of bear in mind the political realities and some of the, you know, the hard trade-offs that we have now to reach, and the tensions inherent in this agreement, and it's time to, I think, sort of this is a good tool, I think, to surface some of those truths and those tensions. When I was working in the mayor of LA's office, I remember one initiative was, one of his signature initiatives was planting 1 million trees. I wasn't quite, you know, out to 2050. I think it was a 10-year timeline. And I can see a video camera on me right here. So, but when I sort of took the job, and I was like, you know, as head of delivery, you know, and so you're going around, so how many trees have we planted? And I think it was, you know, a couple of hundred. And so you used to think, okay, there's a bit of an issue there with the model and the cost, et cetera, et cetera. So the governance part of it, the long-term planning, I think, is key. I'm now at E3G, where we're based in London, but offices in Berlin and Rome, and I'm in Washington, D.C. still. And we like to talk about the real economy of this transformation. And we follow very closely the regime, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and work very hard within the regime, but try and keep it connected with the real economy and make sure there's a positive feedback loop between changes that are happening out there in the real world and make sure they get fed into the negotiations and vice versa. So it's good, I think, when you talk about long-term planning, it is a tool to sort of connect the reality sort of with the rhetoric, and to make sure the two don't get too divorced from each other. So on that, I think in the context of the negotiations here, I've been talking to lots of negotiators, and we're talking very much now about raising ambition, and how we get ready for the ratchet up mechanism. And I think we talk about raising ambition like it's, I don't know, just going to happen magically. And when you talk to the negotiators, you're like, okay, what needs to happen? And there's been lots of good work about how NDCs could be enhanced. It's not just an increase in temperature. There are a whole range of different ways, including having long-term planning and, you know, serious governance arrangements in place. But one of the key things the negotiators, all of them, has been saying to me, what they're looking to see is what national processes are in place. Because without those national processes, be they short-term or long-term, you cannot seriously, credibly raise ambition. So this is very much this discussion about planning and processes in the context of raising ambition within the COP. I will say the longer term, you know, we have these targets, you know, 2020, 2030, out to 2050 being net carbon zero. I've been looking at some work by Climate Interactive. There's a tool online which you look at different countries, and they're trying to promote this idea of a climate balance, you know, which year a country is in climate balance between the sources and the sinks. And they have this bathtub analogy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Having that tool and having that longer term time horizon, I think, can shift the political attention to what needs to happen sort of down the line, right? So obviously a lot of attention and hard work has been expended getting clean energy embedded into our energy systems and getting the cost of clean energy down far faster than any of the sort of forecasters predicted. But you know, what's down the pike, right? So when you shift and look a longer term, you shift political attention. And that tool, the climate balance, has shifted the discussion, and you can see it reflected here at the COP, just the different side events that are on, the conversations that are taking place around the different sinks. There's a lot more political attention now, not just on mitigation and the sources of greenhouse gases, but how we're going to sort of draw those down from the atmosphere, not just forests. I'm noticing a lot more political attention on the restoration of land, sustainable farming, as well as some of the technology solutions. Things before at previous COPs which you could not talk about are now entering the conversation. And I think it's very... It's in part due to these long-term plans, as well as all the modelling around out to 2050. You see that we have to start finding consensus and finding pathways to these other solutions. So, and also creating different ways for political leadership, again, which is very important. As you said, the UK has shown some political leadership with their climate change committee and having that legally binding tool. The climate balance, year of climate balance, you could imagine some countries being motivated and incentivized to do more, to perhaps be the first to have a year sooner rather than others. So these tools create momentum, but also moments for political leadership, which again in the real world can really motivate action. But a lot has already been said. I think the key reality around these long-term plans and their key value is, I will just say also in your report, even though we've just looked at the summary, and I'm really excited to get my hands on the real thing, because we can see not all long-term plans are equal, right? It's a political choice what methodology you use, right? What goes into those long-term plans? Quantitative targets, qualitative targets, how far out into the future you go, whether you're forecasting or backcasting. So as we hear more about long-term plans and see more of them, we now all know, thanks to your research and your paper, we can have more sophisticated analysis on how robust they are, how the quality of those long-term plans to really drive the agenda. Those that do, I think those that sort of go out to the future and backcast, I think are, as you said, the most valuable. And some of the innovations you've talked about where you are protecting those governance arrangements, I think is key. So they are valuable in terms that they do, as you said, the clarity of purpose here. We are trying to get carbon out of our economies. This is no longer a clean energy, transitioning to a clean energy system. This is transitioning to a low carbon economy. And you can see that shift again in the the plans. And they do, the clarity of purpose and clarity of intent, I think is key. And if you have a long-term plan that's very robust, I think it's good. It's good to give confidence, not in the process here, the Paris Agreement, the negotiations, and they really do give, I think, inject confidence those countries that are grappling with long-term planning, and also helping other countries build their own capacity to do long-term planning. I think really does inject confidence in the negotiations, the Paris Agreement, getting ready for that ratchet up moment, but it also gives confidence to investors. We hear time and time again from investors, what do they want? They want long-term consistency, reliability, and there are lots of examples where we haven't given them that, but where we do, and where we try and align investment cycles with political decisions, and so we avoid lock-in, as you said, but given the confidence to investors, I think is a real key value to these. We know that our infrastructures, you can be very explicit and transparent about the age portfolio of our infrastructures, and aligning those investment cycles, as I said. In theory, when we do long-term planning or system change, the transformation should also be cheaper. I'm sure you've all heard lots of examples where, we're giving money with one hand and taking money away with the other, or making bad investments over here.
If you would slowly wrap up so we can have some questions. Thank you.
Okay, and good investments over here. Okay, so the key point I want to make is the Coherence Agenda. Okay. Long-term planning is not just temporal from here out to the future and making sure they all near-term targets fit with longer-term agenda, but also horizontally. I think, it was your question earlier, I think we haven't yet figured out how to do that really well, and it's been a perennial challenge, that joined-up government. I think with this planning process, I think we're really looking at ways of how to do that. So not just environment, not just energy, agriculture, transport, finance, but looking at that joined up thinking so we get this transformation and we surface some of those trade-offs and those tensions, because the shift is not just about technology, it's also about sort of our power balance in our own societies. And these are conversations that we have to surface, I think, perhaps quietly in cabinet meetings with broader circles, but also nationally with stakeholders. And so the more we see that, I think the more confidence we all have that this transformation is going to take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, I would collect 3 questions again, and I have a lady over here, and again, affiliation and name, and then there is a man over there, and there's a lady over there.
Hello, Rachel Berger from the UK. I'm working with my local transition town and on the issue of sustainable consumption, and I don't see that mentioned, and the effort. You know, it's all very well talking about an energy transition or transformation, but actually we all need to consume less of all kinds of things, not just energy, but stuff. And there's a lot that governments could do to incentivise that. And just a small point of Claire's enthusiasm for the UK. At the moment, so little investment is going into helping people with insulating their homes. The investment into or promotion of fracking instead of renewables is something, despite what the Climate Change Committee has said needs to be done, the government is ignoring it. So trying to get politicians on board, if in the failure of that, it's a matter of getting citizens, so its bottom-up approaches are so important too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really very impressive presentation. Well, I'm Joseph, a delegate from Ghana. I'm not ready to full report, but then at least going through that. And I see the long-term stability, and I look at the legal bindingness. I look at France, yes. Sweden, yes. UK, yes. And I look at Germany, it says no. Now, I'm beginning to suspect. Is it because it's just not easier for UK and then France to say yes because they already have a high nuclear penetration in terms of energy mix. And so they know that after all, they are not emitting CO2. It's very less. Then when it comes to Germany, they are cautious because they still have high coal penetration. So prove me wrong. Thank you.
There was a question over there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mareike Well from the Freie Universität in Berlin. And I have a question for Matthias. Matthias, thanks very much for this report. I look forward to reading it, and I really like the title you chose. So especially the part about driving transformational change. And that surely is the one issue that everybody is looking for here. How can we actually transform whole sectors? How can climate policy actually drive change in the sectors that is not cosmetic, but is really transforming the way that they work in the energy sector, the agricultural sector. And I really enjoyed what you told us about the case studies, but I'm still looking for one example where you say, this is really a lighthouse example of where we don't only have a very, very good project, a very promising development, but a case of a transformation of a sector, or where you would say, here I actually believe that a transformational change is possible. Thanks.
So we have 3 questions. One from our colleague from the UK looking at demand side and local action. The second from our colleague from Ghana looking at Germany's no and the question of the relation to coal and nuclear. And the third one from our colleague from Germany on the transformation lighthouses. Matthias, maybe you want to start. Claire, you want to? And then if you want to add.
Sure. I almost have the feeling that all three of these are potentially even sort of better, addressed to other colleagues on the panel, and I'll explain briefly why. So the response was immediate. Thank you so much, Rachel, for pointing to the sustainable consumption dimension, and also thanks to Marika for asking for specific projects and things sort of that shows what transformation can look like. And I just want to clarify very briefly that, of course, the work that we've just done and tried to compile as a report has been looking at basically the systems with which governments are trying to devise policies and monitor their progress. And so certainly with the national and subnational cases, there are very few instances where there are even policies mentioned in the climate laws. It's all about, this is the framework that we're setting ourselves, we're putting the goals in place, and we're putting a system in place that will give us information about what we can do, will give us a way of adopting policies, and then information on how well we're doing, and we'll follow up on that to make sure that we're getting better. So actually, those systems don't have, except for the ambition and the targets, they don't have transformation per se included just yet. But they are charting a course, a long-term course, and not, every country in the world can say that it's mapped out that course or knows where it's going towards in that direction. Other than, of course, all of those that have in principle signed up to the Paris Agreement, which says, we are all united in saying that this is where we're wanting to go in the long term. But this is Paris, and the other part that I was talking about is, what does the implementation system look like at home? And so why I said earlier that I think that others might be a better place to talk about that is, for example, consumption and lifestyles and sufficiency and substitution, rather than just efficiency improvements and switching from one technology to the other, such in energy, is actually come up in several of the scenarios that are being put forward. But those are still to some extent exceptions, but they're the ones that are most ambitious, right? So in the list that Jakob had in the first part of the event, there is the, zero carbon Britain is obviously one that you're familiar with, that looking at by the colleagues from the Center for Alternative Technology. The Association Négawatt in France, and their scenarios also include, these sufficiency changes. And so I think there is basically some catching up to do, both on the technical side. This is what the scenarios are saying can be done. And there are pioneers there, and then it also still needs to translate very much into policy incentives. And since I've talked so long, I'm not going to talk about Germany, and somebody else can take on that one.
Maybe one lighthouse for a sector is in Germany with the feed-in law, which actually transformed the electricity sector massively, but it's not my place to talk. Claire, please.
Thanks, Rachel. Actually, one of my other talking points was going to be about consumer behaviour and sustainable consumption. I didn't get to that, so thank you for raising it. But, that's the thing about these plans, right? You go out to 2050, or this transformation, because the plans are a means to an end. The end is the transformation to get carbon out of our economies. And carbon is so deeply embedded across our entire economy. It's not just energy. We talk about coal. That's the tip of the iceberg, right? And so we're making some progress, not enough, but coal phase out. Behind coal, you've got oil, gas, right? And when we start talking about, when we're talking about electric vehicles, that's getting at oil, heating, cooling, gas, and the broader consequences of that, like now I'm hearing more, I've seen a couple of side events about fiscal erosion and risks and opportunities. That was never on the agenda before. But again, when you start thinking about these plans, you have to start thinking about all the consequences, planned and otherwise, and the impacts and the knock-on effects. If, we phase out, if we have electric vehicles and we reach the penetration levels that we've set in the times that we've set, the impact on government revenues is pretty substantial, and starting to model that and plan for diversification of our economies and our public finances. But sustainable consumption is another one. You hear more and more about that now. meat, and the raising public awareness about the consequences of eating meat and cows, etc. And I don't know about you, but just again, outside of the COP, in the sort of the real world, I don't know if you have friends. I've had a number of friends now that have become vegetarian because of climate change, right? So again, it's raising awareness, but these are tools, basically. It's a tool to have conversations, not just politically, but with people, publics, shift awareness and then shift behavior. And to your bottom up, I say it's bottom up, top down, roundabout, and back again, right? This is systemic change. And when you look at where we need to get to in 2050, not actually that long away, when I think about, I'll be in my 70s, the other long-term planning we're supposed to be doing around pensions, by then, this whole economy has to change. My kids will be my age. It's not that long. And so to get the pace and scale of the transformation we need, I just think we have to rethink everything. What's gone heretofore, public policy-wise and political, project by project, silo by silo, and the 20, 40 years it takes for a social transformation, be it smoking, wearing seatbelts. We just don't have that luxury. So when we talk about systemic change or long-term plan, this issue of climate change will force us to figure out how to sort of get more integration and longer-term planning and figure out the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. One can only hope.
Thank you very much. Now, looking at the time, we have 3 minutes left. So what I want to do is did you say so? No?
Just that the question wasn't answered, was it?
Yeah. No. We have 3 minutes left, right? So what I would like to ask, that Jacob and Guido, that you combine your comments to the questions also with your famous last words and be crisp. And maybe Guido, since you are somewhat on the official side, also say something about the no of Germany, which I think personally is not connected to coal and nuclear, because if you look at our legal framework on energy and energy transition, there are strong indications that this is not the reason. But let's hear what others have to say. Jacob, please.
Okay, so on the one hand, let me add, but I think Matthias already said it correctly, that we find this also efforts on the consumption side and also the reduction of material uses in the scenarios, but the scenarios is not the policy frameworks, and there's quite a long way to go from the scenarios to the policy frameworks. We have to figure out how this can be achieved. And then my last point would be on the multilateral dimension, is that we already have figured ourselves that we should address this dimension in more detail, and we will start up a project soon where we try to interconnect modelers across Europe, and also on the policy side we try to better interconnect and to come up with more of these multilateral solutions and some exchange between the different countries, the different modelers, and so on.
Thank you very much. Guido?
Yeah, thank you. To this question from Ghana. Well, the German situation is quite challenging currently now, because you always have to see the German situation also together with the European situation. And in the energy sector, we have, for example, the emission trading system, which is just sleeping currently. The CO2 prices are very low, so there is no effect on any incentivizing of new measures, new technologies. And maybe this is one point. The other point is we have very strong stakeholders on the industrial side, but also on the power sector side, which are somehow, which need the coal plants, for example, lignite coal plants. And going on there, the jobs are also in this to see there, and these strong economic reasons are very challenging for not only for the German government but also for the German society, because many people see their jobs are depend on that power sector. Is a quite challenging situation right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have two last words. one by Matthias, one by Claire. Since we run out of time, please be very short. And okay, so 2 minutes before I come to my thank yous.
Excellent. Well, I will just sort of pick up where Guido left and also come back to you there, because the vested power interests sort of that are the ones that are said to be losing from having to induce that transformation. They're sort of creating political resistance in many cases, and also this is visible in some of the case studies also. And so the interesting thing about the stakeholder consultation in Germany, for example, was that by putting a stakeholder process in place that essentially it's public, it's relatively official, it has ministers opening, so the government is saying we are serious about this, we want to hear from all of you, and putting all kinds of different communities, so civil society and business, but also citizens on the same level, basically, creates the level playing field and transparency that actually, in this case, I think angered some of the vested interests who were used to being the ones who had the strongest lobby voice. Because the lobby voice is not, the public voice, but it's the ones behind the scenes. And by actually making this an open and transparent process, I think that one has a chance to reduce those powers a bit. And that's, I think, the last on that specific point. And I just want to therefore say there are several strategies in place for trying to, that we already see examples of how to garner political support. And I think the political support is needed for any transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next side event going to be on all the questions you have asked, because we need more time to discuss. But as we come to an end here, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for contributing, and I want to thank the wonderful colleagues here and in Berlin who have made this possible. So thank to you as well, and let's get the action started. Thank you.
And I guess we can just start now. Do all of you know Thomas Hirsch? Not all? Okay, so actually he's working with the FES and Bread for the World on our Just Transition tour or agenda. And now he will provide like a short, or not so short, I hope, briefing that will give you an overview of what happened so far at the negotiations. And maybe you can also introduce yourself a little bit more.
Oh, okay. Has to be green. Green is good. For Social Democrats, red is better. Okay, my name is Thomas Hirsch. I am the founding director of Climate Development Advice. This is a consultancy network. I have been working in COP since many years. I have been giving policy advice to parties, to other partners, to NGOs, to many different parts. And I have been asked to give at the end of week 1 a brief debriefing, an assessment, what was on the agenda or what is on the agenda of that COP, and what are the proceedings, how far have we come, and what are the scenarios for the second week. I will try my very best to do that. I will take for this something like half an hour, and then we have time to discuss or to raise questions or to deepen certain issues. I will give a general picture overview. I have not been following all the hundreds of different issues, so it's very likely that on some of the specifics, some of you may know more than I do, but this is not a problem. When we have the discussion on these issues, you're a contributor as well, of course. So let us very briefly start with, I was asked to do that without a PowerPoint. It would have been easier with, but anyhow, I do it now without. I would like to start with the particular challenges of this COP. I would combine that in a second step with a mapping of the key actors and the different scenarios, how some of these key actors might move and what that would mean for negotiations. I would, in a third step, provide some my views on the orchestration of the first week, what happened around the COP and in the COP, in the action stream. What does that mean for the negotiation stream? And we would then go through the main topics of this COP, see what criteria for success are, in particular with regard to the expectations of the Fijian COP presidency, and then finally see how far have we moved to achieve that and what is the outlook for the second week. So it's pretty clear that this COP, on the one hand, is a technical COP. It's not a COP where big political decisions are going to be taken, but a technical COP is not less important than a political COP, because a technical COP technically prepares parties so that they can take decisions at the next political COPs. 2018 will be a political COP, 2020 will be a political COP. So technical doesn't mean less important, but different character. This, however, technical COP23 has become politicized simply due to the fact that the US has announced to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So one of the big overarching questions is in how far will parties maintain the good spirit and momentum of Paris, or in how far will this announcement of the US lead to a slithering away, that other parties also start not to take the process any longer very serious. Second challenge is the great urgency of action, because in Paris apart from the 2 degrees goal, also a very aspirational goal, 1.5, was agreed. And all scientific studies show that 1.5 can only be achieved, if at all, when now, pre-2020, massive emission cuts take place. When we talk about a remaining carbon budget for 2 degrees temperature goal of between 800 and 890 gigatons, counting from 2015, for a 1.5, it is much less. There are different calculations, but it could be as little as something lower than 300 gigatons. Maybe 250 or 260, maybe 400, but it's a different dimension. And having 40 gigatons per year in emissions makes it very, very clear that such a small little budget could be eaten up even by 2020 if business as usual takes place. So the great urgency. Third point is this COP is the technical COP to prepare the rule book. That means the details, the technical details of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement as such is good, but it's not technically, it's not very specific. And depending how you read the articles or how you implement the articles, there are many loopholes. So having the rules in place, providing transparency of action, accountability, and so on is tremendously important, and this is what is on the agenda here. Third one is that this is the first island COP, small island COP. That means that the small island states have a particular expectation that this COP will give high attention to their loss and damage, to resilience building, to support for them being the most vulnerable. So more attention or heightened attention on resilience issues. And that goes hand in hand with a strong call to massively scale up means of implementation. If you want to cut emissions more drastically and faster, and if you want to increase resilience, it's a matter of means of implementation, and that has not in terms of negotiations, but in terms of expectations, a high relevance for this COP. And now we have the different groups of countries who are by and far, on the one hand, united to stick to the Paris Agreement. So far, the US attempt or the US announcement has not led to less support of others. That was very clear during the year, G7 summit, G20 summit, and what has happened since then. But on the other hand, they have different interests. And it's important to understand Paris was possible only because of a strong alliance of states with the drivers of ambition. This is the vulnerable countries. This is AOSIS, small island states, least developed countries, a bigger part of the African group, not all of the African countries, Europe, and that is not enough. So what was absolutely crucial for success in Paris, bringing China and the US on board. In a twin, they both went, not coming from the inside circle of the Ambition Alliance, but moving from outside and joining them. And with them, then, their other followers as well. In Paris, a very small group of countries remained skeptical until the end. The oil exporting countries in the end moved. Paris is not in favor of their business model, but having all their big allies and superpowers moving to the agreement meant them to move as well. Some other countries like Turkey, Russia, some ALBA countries, leftist Latin American countries in the end came on board as well, but not really convinced. If we want to give the group of countries a name who is apart from the US, a constant matter of concern, then we talk about the like-minded developing countries group, LMDC, with over the years changing leadership. Currently Saudi Arabia is very active, but India is active as well. China associates with them and then sometimes not. And then there are, by and far, it's many oil exporting countries plus some left, politically very left countries. And they tend to slow down all the processes by raising conceptual or procedural questions. And they tend, and this is first observation for that COP, to go backwards to times before the Paris Agreement. In Paris, it was said, we are united and we overcome the split between developing and developed countries. Not saying that everybody has to contribute the same way, but in future we have not two camps, but we have one group, and within that group we differentiate according to national circumstances, but in a more nuanced way than saying this is the group of developing countries and this is the group of developed countries, and both sit in different boats and both have different rules and regulations and responsibilities to follow. That bifurcated approach was overcome, but like-mindeds still try to step back, and we see that in the first week of that COP again, to divide the world into two camps. That would mean that the same rules would account for China as a big emitter, or Qatar as the richest country in the world, as for Tuvalu or Bangladesh, while the other group, Bulgaria, which is very poor, would have to follow the same standards and provide financially as a rich country like Germany. That bifurcated divide of the world was the pre-Paris setting. It has been overcome in a struggle of years because ambitious countries united and said, we are ambitious, we have a lot of things where we are different, but we have one common goal, and this is why we put together, very much to the discontent of this like-minded group. It was in fact created after the COP in Doha, when for the first time a high ambition coalition, or at that time an ad hoc coalition of ambitious developed and developing countries, was formed. And then like-minded said, we don't want to see that happening again. We want the unity of G77 plus China. If we don't get it in G77 plus China, we form our own group. That was a lot of explanation, but it's absolutely important to understand that, to understand the dynamics. So now we have the situation that the US is moving out. So far, no one follows. And we will see in the second week if there are high-level announcements of relevant countries that indicate in certain degree that others might not really but partly follow the US. My assumption after the first week, this is not going to happen. Neither is the US delegation here strong enough, following a very clear and destructive strategy. They are outspoken only on certain issues, nor are there any indications that other countries, and the most critical would be oil exporting countries, plus Turkey, plus Russia, that they would follow. So I don't think that this is going to happen. If it happens, it's a massive danger, but it's not likely. The other possible scenario, and that scenario we call the drifting away scenario. The second scenario is there's not a strong stream going out, but there is constant efforts of different parties to undermine the integrity of the Paris Agreement. And that must not necessarily come from the US, but it could also come from Iran or Saudi Arabia or Australia or Russia or India or others. And this is something we have to keep an eye on. The only group of countries which I see at that point in time as critical to play that role is in fact the like-minded developing countries. But maybe their moves are only tactical. This is what we will see next week when negotiations become a different type of dynamics. The most positive scenario is called the canoe scenario. So there's the stream of the historically biggest emitter, the US, going out, but the small little canoe drifts against that stream, and the Paris Agreement is going to be further elaborated in its details in a very good way. So probably between that very positive and the middle scenario, we will end up. And have an eye, first and foremost, on this group of like-mindeds. Now looking into the orchestration. A COP, as you see, has an action stream where lots of things are happening, new reports, new studies, new initiatives, and it has its negotiation stream. And the two are working together with each other. What have we seen as relevant events? Well, we had the launch of the Emission Gap Report. Every year UNEP is presenting that report showing the gap in reducing emissions, where we are and where we want to go. And what the main message here is, we are at high risk to fail, because even if all NDCs are going to be implemented, we are completely overshooting too. So we have to double the amount of ambition within the NDCs to achieve 2 degrees, or to remain on a track to have a chance to achieve it. Not speaking about 1.5. We have the Adaptation Gap Report that was launched yesterday or the day before yesterday. That report this year has a very strong notion on how to measure resilience building. Why do they look into indicators and all of that? Well, we are still in the process trying to have a more concrete adaptation goal, which is measurable, because what we have in the Paris Agreement is not measurable. So this is one attempt to provide input on that way to maybe develop a measurable adaptation goal. Then we have a lot of discussions about resilience, and in particular loss and damage. And talking about loss and damage, there's a particular focus on climate-induced migration. You have a huge amount of side events around these issues. And that is clearly related to the fact that we have seen this year so high economic climate-induced loss and damage, droughts in Africa, floods in Southeast and South Asia, and hurricanes in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. And that is a strong signal, in particular with this island COP, that many vulnerable countries expect more action to be taken and expect more recognition of loss and damage in the agenda. And as we will see in a moment, that is a negotiation point. Then I think I would say for me maybe the most notable development I observe is that there is massive support for going renewable. It's really, for me, interesting to see how positively the shift to renewable energies is being discussed in so many events. We don't talk any longer about if it is technically possible or if it is economically viable. No, it's absolutely clear. It's a business model almost everywhere in the world. Going green is much cheaper than going brown for countries with a huge demand in extra energy. And that is there's a lot of support for that move, and at the same time the blaming and shaming on coal is very strong as well. In the past we saw that coming from NGOs, but now we see it almost in all discussions with scientists. That's a very strong development as well, which in a way frames the discussion. Then we have a lot of recognition of pre-2020. How is that so? Well, on the one hand, there's a good reason for that, because as I said, if you want to maintain a chance to stay between 1.5 and 2, it's absolutely necessary to do more pre-2020. I'm just coming from a presentation on a new study on phasing out coal in Germany, and they modeled different pathways, and the main message was, if we divide the remaining carbon budget for the 2 degrees, not the 1.5, then Germany has 9 gigatons left. If we now consider what is the remaining part for electricity, it's something like 4.5 gigatons. If we wait until 2020 before we shut down the first coal-fired power plant, then 1/3 of the remaining electricity budget has gone. That underlines once again the massive need for urgent action, and therefore there is a good point to push for pre-2020, and therefore it would be good to see it on the COP agenda next week. But now the other side of the medal, it's in particular again the like-minded developing country group pushing for 2020, pre-2020 as extra agenda item. Why so? Well, it's also a good way to absorb a lot of energy and space of the remaining negotiations, so that there is much less time left to discuss the Rulebook and the facilitative dialogue or the Talanoa dialogue. So, distract attention, absorb time. That is the bad thing. So the only way out is, and that I would expect for the weekend, that some innovative and ambitious negotiators find ways to deal with pre-2020 ambition without giving less time to the relevant issues like the Rulebook and the Talanoa dialogue. We will see, but we expect proposals coming from the COP presidency during the weekend on that issue. And then we have a lot of discussion about finance, of course, like always. And at that COP, there is this is not a COP where you would expect a lot of pledges, but this is the COP where you expect more clarity how in future financial support will be provided in a transparent way. So transparency of financial support and accountability is a big thing. So this pops up in very different places. So we have not one stream of financial discussions where everything comes together, but we have it almost everywhere. That is a little bit confusing. But one of the main concerns, rightly a concern of developing countries, is that we leave the COP without having worked towards a rule book which will provide the same level of transparency and accountability on financial support as on mitigation. And today they have now started to discuss the first formats, how transparency could be provided. And I think that is very much important. So, to come to an end soon, we have as the main topic on the agenda the development of the Rulebook, or the technical term is Paris Implementation Guidelines. That will provide all the clarity regarding how countries should report in future about their NDC fulfillments, how to make their emission reduction or financial contributions comparable, accountable, transparent, but also how the global stocktake in future will take place. So what we would or should expect from that COP, and this is very much in line with the expectation of the Fijian COP presidency as well, is that we have a skeleton. A skeleton means that parties have identified the key decision points for the future rulebook. You need to know the rulebook has to be decided finally next year, 2018. But the key decision points and options how to deal with that should have been identified. Will they manage to achieve that? Observers and parties say, yes, we have had by and large relatively constructive discussions most of the time, including in the preparatory meetings before the COP officially started. But now we are facing, as always, difficulties in terms of remaining time, and some parties slow down the process. And the biggest actor here is the like-minded developing countries, which say we want to have a structure of the rule book that we have one part, this is the rules for developing countries, and one part, this is the rules for developed countries. Colleagues, if this is going to happen, you can close the rule book and it will have no function. This is not the way. The way is to say we have one rule book, but of course, for those countries with less capacity, and China is not a country with no capacity, nor is Qatar or Saudi Arabia a country with little capacity, but of course Bangladesh is, or many African countries are. They need longer transition periods, and they need for a transition process extra regulations, but still we should have one rule book. And that attempt to say, here we have the rules for the developing countries and here for the developed countries, is a major hit against transparency of action. And that needs to be addressed and has to be overcome. And probably this is one of the most critical questions at that point in time, and it's not really clear where it will go. But most people who are inside the negotiations I talked with said, well, they are still optimistic because many developing countries as well say, no, we need to have one rule book. The second big point is the so-called Talanoa dialogue, or facilitative dialogue as it was called in Paris. This dialogue is an informal stocktake where you would measure in how far we have made progress in achieving the Paris Agreement's goals in 2018. This stocktake is not a formal stocktake because some countries, or many countries, again the like-minded first and foremost, resisted in Paris to call it a formal stocktake. Then the compromise was to have an informal one. Once again, the question, why is that necessary in 2018? Why not only in 2025? Well, we need to scale up the level of ambition in the NDCs we have, and the only way to do that in a structured way is to have this stocktake where we see, wow, this is the remaining gaps. Now, there are many more, but basically two key opinions how to do the stocktake. The ones say, and this is like-minded, but I think they will step by step move out from that proposal. It has to take place based on negotiated outcome. And that means if you negotiate the form how a stocktake takes place with those who are unwilling to make it a strong tool, you will end up at the least common denominator, and you will have a weak type of stocktake. The other option is, and that is the option which was always preferred by Fiji, and today they presented to all the country groups in formal paper how it should look like. This is something they call Talanoa dialogue. Talanoa is a Pacific word, means bringing together people in small groups, sitting there, not finger pointing on anybody, discussing problems by telling stories, and finally finding solutions. And this, have that picture in mind, is what they want to do. So what they propose in the paper they share today, we have a process, which is the Talanoa dialogue, and that starts at that COP and it ends at the next COP. And we will answer 3 questions. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And how will we achieve what we want to achieve? And they want to have, over the next 12 months, for most of the time, a technical discussion on that, and they expect science to contribute. They expect the already scheduled big conferences, like Macron's finance conference in December, like the California conference of non-state actors in September, but also the IPCC report in October to be launched as relevant inputs. And they invite everybody, observer or party, to make further inputs, and they want to give the Secretariat the role to make a type of synthesis report, as it was also done with the NDCs several years back, and then use the last part of that 12-month journey as the part where policymakers, decision makers, high-level ministers and heads of state say, okay, these are the facts, we look at it, and then we discuss how to find solutions so that we can give the answers. And they say they want, through that process, to raise ambition. And that is the tricky point, because some countries, like India, for example, has already strongly rejected the idea that NDCs, at least their NDC, should be revisited and scaled up. They said that was never agreed in Paris. So this is what is now on the table. These are the two different proposals. And today there was also a consultation. Now there is a series of consultations. So the COP presidency has consultations with the different country groups, but also with stakeholders. So I'm hearing that many show satisfaction, but of course it's not, maybe not specific enough. So it's a 3-pager, and you see a graph in that, but it's a skeleton. But many say, or most say, this is a good starting point. Now we will see how that will now be taken further in the formal negotiations, and that will be, apart from the rule book, the second big, very decisive question next week. Now, really coming to an end very shortly on the UN Adaptation Fund. In that COP, the adaptation framework is under review, but the big question, or the biggest question here, is how to go with the UN Adaptation Fund. The UN Adaptation Fund is legally bound to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is going to be outgoing when the Paris Agreement comes into place. So most countries, developing countries, say we are happy with the UN Adaptation Fund, and they want to move it to the new financial architecture of the Paris Agreement. And they proposed yesterday that a decision should be taken, simply saying in the COP decision of that COP, the Adaptation Fund shall serve the Paris Agreement. Full stop. If you have this, then you can say the details will be negotiated until the next COP. That would be a perfect solution, but unfortunately there is resistance from some developing countries. I talked with the relevant person in the German delegation today, and he told me, I'm very unhappy. I would sign it immediately and then it's done, but very unfortunately there are many opposing. This is something you have to deal with. It's in particular the UK, which is very much opposing to continue with the UN Adaptation Fund. They argue not efficient. We want to make it, adaptation should find its place in the Green Climate Fund. This is enough. This is not enough. So work on that. Then on loss and damage, here formally the work plan of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage has to be adopted. Informally, there is a high level of expectation that the level of recognition for loss and damage should be, in future COPs, should be raised. And there's a high level of expectation that more money is going to loss and damage. So what is on the table now? There's by and large agreement on the work plan. There's still some criticism on the weak part on finance, but they will find their way. How to raise recognition for loss and damage. G77 and China proposed to make it a standard reporting issue for Substar so that it comes up every year. That was then rejected by industrialized countries. And now they work around other options. So G77 plus China said, okay, we accept that. We withdraw our proposal. This is a large step from us. Now we expect a large step from you. And what is now being discussed is to have what they call annual in-session Bula Forum for in-depth discussion of loss and damage, and there is Bula and 2 or 3 other proposals being met, how it also Pacific names. Let's see if this is going to come. On finance, there's now progress with regard to financing the WIM. So I think 630,000 euro per year or for the next budget in the core budget of the Secretariat has been earmarked for the WIM work. So far it was not part of the core budget. And for expert groups giving support to the WIM, there will be additional funding. This is the progress we see, and I think that's very relevant. The other idea that we will leave that COP with a huge loss and damage fund, simply forget about that. That is not going to happen. That is completely unrealistic. And I would not even say that it is a good strategy to be very outspoken on that, because this discussion is not prepared. That what is now needed first is to say, let's look into the various options we have to provide finance for loss and damage, or risk finance, you could call it. And then seeing the options, then you can assess them and say, okay, strategically we promote this or that. But that has not been done, so I think it will land nowhere. And also because emerging economies have no appetite for this discussion, because in particular the rich oil exporting states all fear that in the end there may be something like obligations on them to pay. So this is, and the last sentence, there is now ongoing discussion how in future the role of non-state actors in implementing the Paris Agreement can be stimulated. It's pretty clear that without non-state actors, and that is everybody below the level of the federal state, without the cities, the union states, the companies, the trade unions, the NGOs, and so on, you cannot implement. So they have to come on board. And how to make that happen in a treaty where the parties are the treaty holders, and in particular in view of the US situation, where you have 13 US states who have announced we will fulfill the Paris Agreement, but they are no party to the agreement. How to deal with them? That in light of the withdrawal announcement of the US is even a more burning question, how to work with non-state actors. So here there is a lot of focus of the Fijian presidency to move that forward. And but there is nothing mature achieved yet. And say in the end, I would say with regard to the criteria for success, the first week was okay, more positive than negative, but there are still question marks, and it's too early to predict in how far the main deliverables, Rulebook and Talanoa dialogue will in the end be shaped as they should be shaped to stay below 2 or at best at 1.5. And I think here CSOs have to be very vocal and have to very clearly address their expectation on each party that these 2 deliverables have to be robust in the end. Otherwise, parties would have failed. Thank you for your attention. I have spoken too much time. So, the proposal now is we speak here, and once we have to move out, originally we planned to have 2 hours. I will stay there, and I have 1 more hour, and those who have further questions can address them outside. Okay.
Okay, so if anybody has questions, now it's time to raise your hand. Okay, if it's just one, you can just ask, and if it will become more, we will collect. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Also möchtest du lieber sammeln oder lieber einzeln? Also wir haben ja eigentlich
I don't need this. I'm a loud person. So yeah, it's about the pre-2020 ambition. So it's been very new to the delegations, especially in the developing countries, and discussing the pre-2020 ambition with them. Does it necessarily mean that they have to peak by 2020 or before? Because it's really hard to let them discuss this in the negotiations.
No, it's not necessary that any developed country has to peak before 2020. And if we talk about the 95% of small and not very polluting developing countries, they should not be nervous. There's no expectation on them. It would be great to see that China overachieves its announced targets, the big players. It would be very relevant that those countries who are now planning to invest in further coal-fired power plants give that up. And that is South Asia and Southeast Asia, China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh. I heard a figure, if these countries fulfill all their plans with new coal-fired power plants, that alone, if they all would run 30 years, and that is the minimum you need to reach the break-even, this would be 450 to 490 gigatons. This is more than half of the remaining entire budget, which is not only for energy, but also for transport, agriculture, and all the countries. No. What is to be expected is that all countries are prepared, start to become familiar with the idea to revisit their NDC in light of the outcome of the Talanoa dialogue next year, and then they have 2 years to improve it. Not to start, developing countries at least, not to act pre-2020. Pre-2020 was always the strong call on the developed, industrialized countries. And they are in the spotlight. And they, yes, also Germany, now being in negotiations about the new government, they cannot wait until 2020, and they have to fulfill their promises and commitments, what they made already in Durban, to do more by 2020. And it's absolutely true that the track record of almost all developed countries in these years is poor, or at least not to the mark. The pressure should be on them. But that, again, should not mean to say stop talking post-2020 and only talk pre-2020. So we have to deal with the two things. And what the linkage of those countries now calling for raising pre-2020 ambition is a good one, saying now this year we have the anniversary of the Kyoto Protocol. That's nice. But what is more needed is that the last commitment period, which is now, leads to good results. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. Quick one. How do you see the just transition issues evolving throughout this whole process and what you've mentioned?
I wanted to mention that as well. Just transition is getting traction. I see much more discussion on just transition at that COP as compared with previous COPs. It's not only trade unions talking about that, but it's more and more other actors. And why is that happening? Well, if you take it serious to close to do a fast transition, everybody immediately understands that maybe the biggest hurdle here is the social question, because technically and economically it's not the problem. And therefore the question how to shape transition in a way that it is being supported by the people gets now more relevant. But please, colleagues from trade unions, be so kind and seek the discussions with others who talk about justice as well. The very narrow focus on those losing jobs is by far not enough. Justice concerns go far beyond that. And having a broader discussion, I think, would be very helpful.
Can I quickly, because I have to go for a meeting, and my voice is loud enough.
Use the mic.
You know, I have been at the negotiations right from Berlin, and many things have happened. But I think this attempt to say that the developing and developed country thing doesn't exist is contradictory. You in your remarks are already saying that developed countries don't want to do this or the developing countries do that. The existence exists. You're trying to paper over it. So I think the problem with the pre-20 discussion is basically the commitment of the Kyoto Protocol issue, basically. Because a second commitment period, not very many developed countries have signed on to it. So I think that's where the unhappiness is. And that's where they want the deliverables.
Well, very politely allow me to disagree with you. I agree in many regards. There's no point that industrialized countries are not fulfilling their commitments. And I said that. What my message is, you have to differentiate. That is a matter of justice. But a differentiation in two camps only, yes, did reflect the world in 1990, but by far is not reflecting the world today. Because that would leave countries like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, who have the highest per capita emissions and who are the richest countries, off the hook. And that we have to avoid. And the second point you need to see is that if we talk about historic responsibility, which is a great concept, if we take the time span 850 to 2030, the next 10 years, because everything we plan now in terms of coal-fired power plants is now planned but will come into the place 2025. If we take that time span, then the cumulated emissions of the 7 biggest industrialized countries are similar to the cumulated emissions of the 7 biggest emerging economies. And that shows that it is scientifically, it's nonsense to only talk about emission reduction of the industrialized world, then we will completely fail.
I agree partly with you.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
It's on.
It's on. Okay. My question is like, I'm not talking about the COP inside, but what is happening outside with some countries like France and that are kind of stepping back on their decisions. I don't know if that's the feeling. You said that the first week is more positive than negative, but now with the US going out, I think many developed countries are kind of thinking of what should be the engagement they will have for the next years.
In the end of the day, it's difficult to predict what is going to happen, but I have a quite strong feeling that there's no appetite of the G6 to follow the US. They have made that clear so many times, and economically it would simply be stupid. We see, however, that some France is slightly redefining its targets, and what I find as a German much more disappointing is that Germany will definitely fail its 2040 target. Not minus 40%, but at best minus 32%. Okay, there are some extra aspects because Germany then in the period decided to step out of nuclear, and that puts much more pressure on the renewables, but still it's absolutely unacceptable. And that the now discussions between the parties who are supposed to form the new government have as one of the most critical issues climate and energy policies, and that there is strong resistance from some neoliberals is really very disappointing. Still, I wouldn't see that as a strong indicator that the other G6 in the end follow the US. The G6, Europe, is in a very difficult situation. They want to maintain on board. They want to fulfill the Paris Agreement. It was achieved in Paris, in Europe, but they have to struggle. We can stay until 6:30, good. They have to struggle with Poland and others who depend on fossils. And they are in a new world. In the past, it was simply not something you would have considered to do, to take major decisions against the US. And now, Europe has to do that. They have to now work much closer with China, but there's a lot of mistrust, and there's not a lot of experience in doing so. And then the EU is with the Brexit and so many problems, migration, right-wing parties winning. There's a lot of pressure on Europe. So they are not really fit. We are currently not very fit. But we have to take a decision which we never took before. Let the US stand alone and go with China. And that is something that takes time. This is how I would see it. We don't have the time, yeah. And I would say now we need brave decisions. And the first one is to say, yes, we increase pre-2020. No doubt about that.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, for painting a very good picture on the various scenarios. I just wanted a clarification on the second scenario, on the tactical approach of undermining the Paris Agreement by the like-minded development states. Yesterday, during the Stock Track meeting, some of the developed and developing countries, they are on the view that the guidance on the NDCs should be on the mitigation concept component, while some of the developing and the like-minded development states, they are of the view that the guidance on NDCs should encompass both adaptation, mitigation, and also the means of implementation. So the same plays on the second scenario that you mentioned. Probably what might be the likely outcome of the second scenario if we have that tactical approach of maybe delaying or undermining the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
I can tell you what I would hope or expect, or what I hope to see happening. Of course, we need NDC guidelines on mitigation plus adaptation plus means of implementation. Of course, it is absolutely in line with the Paris Agreement to expect the same level of transparency on climate finance as on mitigation. The appetite of the different countries is different, of course, and maybe one never know in beforehand, maybe and maybe even probably, all the fights from the like-minded to have that two rule books are only a tactical means to bring in more transparency on finance and to give them a little bit more room and flexibility in mitigation. I hope that this is the reason, and I guess it is, but you never know. Ambitious countries from the global south have to make it very clear to industrialized countries that accountability for finance, I repeat myself, is as important as for mitigation. Because if you don't have that, you have no trust builder and you have no accountability, and then free riders will start to do their business. With adaptation, the problem is a little bit, most NDCs of industrialized countries are not covering adaptation at all. And most NDCs of developed countries do so. But most developed countries, yes, they say this is what we want to do and need to do in terms of resilience building, but they, at the same point in time, argue, but you should not overburden us with reporting guidelines. So we know what we want to do, but don't bother us with too much guidelines how to report on outcome, which I find not acceptable, because, sorry, Lesotho is responsible to its people, and then the government should make itself transparent and accountable to the donors, but also to the own people. This is where NGOs from the global south have to lobby for. Industrialized countries will not do, because they have no appetite to report on adaptation neither. It's an extra burden for them as well. 1, 2. Where's the micro?
It is here, Niti is here.
Niti from Malaysia, and also
Transformational Ende. Also Racket läuft überall. Läuft schon.
Hier müsste eigentlich noch Null sein.
And I'm happy to see you all here. I know that there will be more people coming in, hopefully. My name is Vlad Trushka, and I'm the team lead for the supporting mitigation tools in the UNFCCC Secretariat. And we are organizing this technical briefing on national appropriate mitigation actions, the NAMAs, and the registries for NAMAs and NDCs. I have with me on the panel representatives from NAMA facility, the GEF. I will ask them to introduce themselves the moment they will start with their presentation, and I also have my colleague from the Secretariat. The main objective for this side event is to provide you with a bit more information and a place to exchange views on the NAMA support, on the operation of the NAMA registry, and also you hear a bit from us on the NDC registry, the interim registry that is functioning now. So without further ado, I will ask Ash Sharma from the NAMA facility to tell you a bit more on the lessons learned, on the experiences for NDC implementation at the NAMA facility. Ash, you have. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Okay. First of all, thank you to the Secretariat for this invitation. I'm very pleased to say that the NAMA facility considers itself, or tries to model itself, as being a learning and disseminating institution. So we are involved in a lot of these kinds of activities. So we're very happy to be able to share some of these lessons learned. Just to move directly into the presentation. Hopefully. Oh, it's not moving? It's not working with the laptop in front. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. So we go to the first slide. You can see that really the NAMA facility is an instrument which has been set up by the governments of the United Kingdom, Germany, together with Denmark and the EU, to provide funding for NAMAs, for nationally appropriate mitigation actions. And we consider that NAMAs really are an important vehicle, a means whereby countries can implement their NDCs under the Paris Agreement. So that's very much a focus of what we do. We work with countries to support them in NDC implementation. Since the facility was set up, it has made available around 260 million euros and operates with a technical support unit based in Berlin. So if we move to the next slide, please, Gopal, thank you. Here you can see what we actually support. We support the so-called NAMA support project. So this is what we fund. You'll see it's a subset of the larger sector-wide NAMA. So we're not supporting the entire program, but we support the most ambitious part of the NAMA program. And typically the NAMAs involve funding for financial and technical components. These are selected on an annual basis. And we typically have funding for each program in the range of around 5 to 20 million euros. From our side, that comes as a grant, but as I say, we usually have some financial aspects, which I'll talk about later on. To date, we have selected 21 projects around the world, and I'll show you a map of those. The key requirements for selecting projects are implementation readiness. Will this program be ready to achieve mitigation outcomes within the time frame? Mitigation potential. It is a mitigation instrument, so we want to make sure that we have a significant level of ambition there. and transformational change, which is a topic in itself, and one could write a PhD on that alone. But we try to operationalize this concept to the extent that we can. So here we see the map. We see that we have, I believe, 17 countries supported. We have projects in a range of sectors, and we also try to address some of the hard-to-get sectors. So we have projects in the transportation, in land use as well, agriculture. But actually, I think a small majority of projects are in the energy sector. So the idea really is to focus on transformation, as I say, to shift a sector in a country towards this sustainable, irreversible, low-carbon pathway, and one that happens much quicker than the business-as-usual development of technological trajectory, shall we say. So we want to achieve this transformational change with a relatively modest amount of money. So what we need really is, in order to achieve this level of ambition, is to have leveraging of the funds that we put in. So for each euro that is put in by the facility, we expect a significant level of leveraging. And you can see from the graph, just you don't need to try and read it, but you can just see that we try to get leveraging of the order that we've worked out in the first three calls is roughly 1 to 7. So for every euro that we put in, we expect 7 euros of investment, and that's both from public and private sources. Ideally, we would like to see more leveraging of private money. Public money, leveraging public money really doesn't move the needle in terms of investment. So financial mechanisms are really at the core of the NAMA. They are required to really kickstart the reversal of these funding flows. So the funding that we have currently going towards the sort of the brown trajectory, we want to try and move that towards the green trajectory. And we've seen that there are actually quite a diversity of potential instruments that are being used, which you'll see in the next slide. But I'll just mention that at this point we see that most projects, most so-called NAMA support projects that we fund, have a mix of at least 2 financing instruments. We also try to encourage results-based financing, so financing which incorporates payment for performance of certain aspects, but we find that's actually quite limited due to the reach of what you can really do with 20 million euros. And if we go, I think we have the. Do we have this next slide? Oh, yes. If you just forward a few slides, please, Gopal, to the diagram. No, if you go forward, sorry. It should be a slide with lots of dots on there, right? Just to fast forward there. Here you can see, and the presentation will be made available, you can see the kinds of instruments that have been used. So typically you have a number of instruments, and roughly speaking, you're seeing that as you go up the y-axis, you have more and more leveraging of the public funds. So if we go back, sorry to skip, if we go back to the issues we find on ambition. Now we work with governments, so the idea here is really to support governments and projects which have been supported and which have scored most highly in the evaluation process are the ones that have demonstrated strong commitment and the embeddedness of the policies that they put forward. And by embeddedness, we mean that these policies are rooted in domestic policies. So the NAMAs are rooted in domestic policies. There should be a good and strong relationship to the relevant NDC and the significance of the sector in terms of national emissions should be strong. So a sector should contribute to let's say, in excess of 5% of national emissions. The mitigation aspect, the ambition I referred to before, is very key. But we've seen that often projects and proposals have overestimated or poorly substantiated what they can really achieve. While we focus on greenhouse gas mitigation in terms of the direct contribution, we see that there is a lack of information around the indirect mitigation benefits. So when you consider the project boundaries, there are some very interesting indirect mitigation benefits which are often missed. For example, black carbon is something that is often not highlighted well enough, and that's an interesting short-lived climate forcer. If we continue with the next slide, the issues around transformational change, as I said, we try to operationalize that, but what we're trying to see here really is the demonstration of government's willingness to make this irreversible change, as we said. So some ways of trying to understand this would be to what extent have policy reforms and fiscal instruments, including the enforcement of these measures, how have they been outlined in this proposal? So, for example, we've seen very good projects which have limitations or bans or phase-outs of refrigerants, for example, in some countries, the use of fees and economic instruments, including fossil fuel subsidy reforms and other ways of redirecting harmful subsidies. So a good example would be where you would phase out fossil fuel subsidies and redirect those funds towards renewable energies, for instance. We also want projects which will move beyond a conventional project scenario. So while it's all good and well having an on-grid PV power plant, for example, that's not really going to move the needle in terms of a sector. So another example would be a typical replacement scenario. So we've seen, for instance, energy sector refits in public buildings, where you're simply replacing old technology with new insulation. That really is a business as usual approach, and we want to see moving beyond that. So, for example, in the buildings analogy, you would try to have a whole of building approach, a more holistic approach around design, passive house interventions, and so forth. If we move to feasibility, I think we look for the importance of a plausible project rationale and scope. Maybe a rather obvious comment, but it's often the case that we see many projects which fail here. The readiness is important, taking into account the 5 years of implementation. Do projects, for example, take into account issues around public procurement, which can take several years, also planning processes, which can take a long time. Many projects build on pilots and predecessor initiatives. Often we see that these are simply mentioned, but there's no real thought that's gone into how these can be improved upon. How have strategies and mechanisms that have worked well, how can they be scaled up, and ones that haven't worked so well, how can we learn from those lessons? Again, and rather what one would think would be a self-evident point about technology considerations, we often don't see projects which have described the climate-friendly technology to be deployed adequately described. You have to show really what are the advantages of this technology, and for example, where you have, let's say, cook stoves or other off-grid technologies, we know that there are a large number of these technologies, micro-technologies around. Which ones are most appropriate and why? Has it been tested? the economic and technical viability of that technology in this country should be clearly addressed. And what is the business case for these sub projects? That's very important. In terms of financial sustainability, as I said, this is an area where a lot of projects do fall down. You know, we've seen that typically, especially in the early calls that we had, we've seen projects which put forward short-term instruments that can be funded by the facility, with, for example, interest rate subsidies. Now, interest rate subsidies and concessional financing is important. It does have an important role to play. But in many cases, there's an opportunity to look at more permanent financing sources to redirect these financial flows. For example, redirection of funding in public sector budgets, the use of domestic taxes, the use of guarantee instruments. In certain cases, we see an important contribution from private households in the cookstove sector, for instance, and from industry. We've seen also in the refrigeration and air conditioning sectors. That's been a very important aspect that we've seen in Southeast Asia, for instance. All these go towards building a more financially sustainable NAMA, which will continue long after our grant funding has been phased out. So, for example, we've seen that financial ambition is best evidenced through these leveraging. I mentioned leveraging earlier on. What can you do with each euro that you put in? And I think that's important to, for example, include investors' equity. We have an interesting project in Mexico which is using investors' funding from industry in the sugar sector, also commercial bank loans, user fees, tariffs, etc. And also, as I've touched on before, the mobilization of domestic public sector funding and budgetary allocations are an excellent way of demonstrating country ownership and buy-in. We shouldn't also forget that there's an important role for public for policy reforms and regulatory changes. And often, if we look at that in terms of what can be achieved, technical assistance has a very strong role to play in that regard. So we skipped this slide. We've talked about that. Just to conclude, really, just some general comments as regards NAMAs and LDCs. You know, I said at the beginning that we see the NDC as the building block of the Paris Agreement, and in turn, the NAMAs really are an opportunity to help countries to achieve those NDCs. So that's really what we try to pitch our facility as a means of supporting the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement through the NDCs provides a context and a mandate to play an ongoing role in mitigation. And NAMAs are very much aligned with this domestic support agenda. By their very nature, they are supposed to be nationally appropriate, and so therefore you have another linkage there with the NDCs. If we go to the next slide, final slide. In terms of the NAMAs, we do see that there are vehicles for learning and disseminating best practices. We're looking to build up an evidence base. We have 21 projects, and we try to disseminate what we can in terms of what works, what are the practical experiences, how do we build this up, and we're happy to partner with the Secretariat at various functions and events to try and get this information out there and to try and disseminate this evidence base. We also see that NAMAs are a test bed for the innovative use of financial instruments and business models going forward. And let's not forget that there are strong linkages in regard to the Sustainable Development Goals and broader development outcomes. So I will end there. If you indulge me, I will just make one announcement. On Monday, we have a side event at the EU Pavilion at 9:30, where we will have a number of statements from the ministers from some of the donor countries. And I can give you a preview that we hope to make a bit of a splash on Monday. So I hope you'll join us there on what should be an interesting event, and also an opportunity to learn from some of the countries who have been supporting projects and putting forward projects. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you so much for coming and for the ideas that were presented. I know that you will have to leave earlier today, so if you have any questions for him, we can go like this and take some questions for Ash and then continue with our stuff. If you have any questions, yes.
You're stealing our thunder from Monday. Please come and see us on Monday morning. The coffee will be good. The coffee will be good because the coffee that we will be serving will be carbon neutral coffee from our Costa Rica coffee program.
So now you have another reason to go to the side event.
I was going to make the analogy about the proof of the pudding is in the eating, but the proof of the pudding is in the drinking.
I also have. I was thinking about a question to Ash, because I think it's important now to have this continuation of the visibility of NAMAs, and I'm curious. How do you see, from your perspective, the importance now of NAMAs after the Paris Agreement was signed and entered into force? I'm curious, how do you see NAMAs going on? How do you see the link between NAMAs and NDCs now going forward?
Okay, thank you for that question. Excuse me. Well, I think I will give you some evidence. I think the first call that we had after the Paris Agreement, we saw a doubling of the applications to the facility. I think that there is a lot of interest in these programs, and I think that we really try and pitch it as I mentioned, as a way of supporting countries in their NDC endeavors. Essentially, these are climate programs. I mean, they have a fancy name, but they're climate programs. And a typical climate NAMA will have, for example, a reform and a policy component. It will have a pipeline building component where you develop projects, real investments, and it will have a financial instrument. So when you pull those things together and you have a level of monitoring, reporting, and verification, I think you have a NAMA, and that is entirely consistent with the NDC approach.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And again, if there are any other questions, if they are not, we are doing a slight small change in the program, and I will thank Ash for coming with us. And I would like to give the floor to David Rogers from GEF to share a bit of his knowledge and the GEF experiences and lessons learned for supporting the countries in implementing the NAMAs, and then we will show you a bit of how we are doing with the NAMA registry and the NDC registry in the Secretariat. So, David, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the last time we gave a report on the GEF support for NAMAs in 2015, we had at that time supported 12 NAMAs. As of now, that's risen to 23. projects in a variety of countries. 16 are full-size NAMA projects that are in the process of being registered or already registered, and another 7 projects that have NAMA-related components. Now, for most of you, you know that Jeff's been funding climate change mitigation projects for over 25 years. And an easy question to come up is, well, what's the difference between a NAMA project and a climate change mitigation project at the Jeff? So one of the things that we like to point out is that when the NAMA concept came forward, it was clear that each of those ideas had to have a strong focus on measurement, reporting, and validation, or MRV, and that there would be a strong linkage to national strategies for mitigation action development and mainstreaming of the mitigation actions. And of course, then there was the goal of having all of these projects included in the NAMA registry. So with that, I can report that most of the Jeff projects on mitigation, which we are currently funding, could have been submitted as NAMA projects if the designers had wanted to do that. But the good news is that these 23 projects have been submitted and are part of the record. And I think I agree with the former speaker that the NAMA projects are very much aligned with the country's national strategies. And as part of the Jeff review for every project now in the Jeff 6, since the signing of the Paris Agreement, we ensure that the mitigation projects are fully aligned with the country's nationally determined contributions. So this means for us that the NAMA projects that have been approved since Paris and all the other Jeff mitigation projects that have been approved since Paris have been checked to ensure that they align with the country's national strategies consistent with the NDCs. And of course, the Jeff has been on the ground with countries providing grant support to help develop some of those NDCs, and we are still able to do that for countries that wish to upgrade or update their NDCs. And now we're in the mode of implementing, helping countries implement their NDCs. I think also we should be paying attention to the fact that the concepts and the requirements for MRV are also evolving. And in the Paris Agreement, we have now the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency to provide support to countries to improve their ability to monitor and report, document their compliance with their own targets. And the Jeff has been very pleased to have received an assignment from the parties to launch the trust fund for the Capacity Building Initiative on Transparency. We were at very capable staff that stood up the trust fund within 12 months' time, and we've already awarded 10 projects under that fund to countries specifically for the purpose of establishing activities consistent with the CBIT. And we do expect that the CBIT will become a permanent feature of the Jeff. So in our most recent round of funding request to the donors as part of our Jeff 7 replenishment, we've included not only a robust climate change mitigation program that would stay aligned with the country's NDCs, but we've also requested support to continue and strengthen the CBIT. Let me add one last comment. I do very much agree with the former speaker that using grant funding only gets you so far. So we do very strongly encourage our countries in both their NAMA projects and any of their other projects to seek out significant co-financing, leverage, and participation of the private sector. I just came from a briefing earlier today on building energy efficiency, where the Jeff is very fortunate to be working with more than 20 private sector companies and other NGO partners to promote building energy efficiency in its in cities. So that's a good example. So let me just wrap up there and say we're very pleased to be able to report that we continue to support NAMA projects from countries. We expect them to continue to submit strong mitigation projects in the remaining 6 months of the GEF 6 cycle and then in the GEF 7 cycle. And we look forward to working with the Secretariat to see what the next steps are on the registry and where it goes from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you first of all for coming. I know it's late, full days of negotiations, and we coming from the Bula zone, it's kind of complicated, but I really appreciate for you coming here, and I think again, as mentioned before, we see also still the importance of moving forward with the NAMAs, because what we have seen again in the last period, especially after Paris Agreement, parties and people started to speak a lot on the NDCs, but we see the need to involve NAMAs in implementing NDCs, because at the end of the day, NDCs are big strategic plans for the countries, and at the end of the day, you need to go to the bottom to do actions and projects, and NAMAs are good for this. So I'm very glad for you again assuring people that GEF will continue to finance NAMAs, and we also heard the same from the NAMA facility. So I'm pretty sure that with the passing of the time, there will be more and more, and there will be more experience in doing this at the country level. Without further ado, I will ask my colleague Gopal to show you a little bit of what we are doing at the Secretariat with the NAMA registry, and how this has progressed in the last years since we met in Marrakesh exactly 1 year ago, as we are having this report back to you every year. So Gopal.
Thank you very much, Vlad, and good evening, everybody. This brief presentation will based on the annual report on the operation of a NAMA registry for the consideration of the COP, and as mentioned earlier by Vlad, this is prepared as decided by the COP. So just to give the background, the NAMA registry is a web-based online platform where countries or other relevant stakeholders can take part on voluntary basis to record their action on mitigation, as well as support received or support provided for those kind of actions in the developing countries. So based on that, we can mention that NAMA registry basically records all the mitigation actions that the current the developing countries are undertaking with mobilizing their internal resources for the international recognitions. Likewise, if they require any international support to implement their action, they can also record those kind of actions requesting for the international support. At the same time, the international organizations or support agencies can put information or provide information regarding their support program related to the mitigation actions or NAMAs. So by having this kind of information, the registry basically aims to facilitate matching between the support needed and support provided. So basically it has the database of all the information on NAMA actions, as well as support provided or support available. And by using the interface of this registry, countries or relevant stakeholders can put or provide the information to the registry for the public consumption. To support the use of the NAMA registry, we at the Secretariat organizing various kind of activities, from the technical day-to-day technical assistance training to the coming up with the supporting materials, as well as engagement activities to increase the use of the registry. So then this slide talks about what are the benefits of participating in the registry for the country or other relevant stakeholders. So basically we can categorize 3 benefits. One is promotion and marketing. Second thing, authentic official source for any information, data or knowledge related to the NAMAs or support needed or support available for this kind of actions. So by putting information on the actions or support available, it will basically tries to give the visibility for those kind of actions or those kind of support provided, and all the information that has been recorded in the registry will actually goes into the annual COPE report, which will be considered annually by the Conference of Parties. In that way, it's a medium for the providing great visibility, at the same time increasing the opportunity to obtain the international support. The most important function or most important benefit that from this platform the users can get is that the sharing of best practices, the technical tools or information which could be useful for designing or implementing this kind of actions can be easily shared or can be disseminated through the platform. So these are in addition to these things, we think that the registry could also play some additional roles in the context of the Paris Agreement, because we are trying to build a new climate regime, many reporting or many infrastructures under the Paris Agreement. In that context, instead of creating the new rules or repeating the same things, we can also think how the existing platform, including NAMA registry, could solve the new climate regime. Especially, as mentioned earlier, under the NDCs, all the actionable actions which will be implemented at the ground level can be recorded in the registry. At the same time, what kind of supports or what kind of what is the need of the country is for those actions can be also recorded in the registry. So it could also serve as a tracking system for the international support provided for the mitigation actions, and not only that, it can also report back on the progress of the mitigation actions and the co-benefits. So if these actions can implement the robust monitoring mechanisms, so all the results from that monitoring can be easily captured and disseminated through the system. So at the last, the most importantly, as also mentioned that there are many lessons learned or many good experiences explaining that what works in terms of investment, planning or support that can be easily captured and disseminated through the registry. So in that context, we expect the parties to explore ways how this registry can serve the new climate regime. My second part of this presentation briefly talks about the major highlights of that annual report on the NAMA registry operation. So this slide shows the participation level of the users in terms of absolute numbers, as well as in terms of in distribution in the regional groups. So from the upper chart, we can see that in 2017 we saw the increase of 4% in terms of users, and now about 69% of developing countries have access to the NAMA registry so that they can submit their NAMAs. And the the below slide shows the regional distribution in terms of access rights for the NAMA registry to the and the second slide, this slide deals with the numbers of NAMAs or information recorded in the registry. So in compared to 2015 and 16, 2017 has seen a slight increase of 9% compared to the 2016. And the region-wise, we can see that the Asia Pacific state has the highest. The LDCs group, likewise seats, and seats have the highest rate of increase rate in terms of submitted NAMAs. And we mentioned that around 69% countries have the access to the NAMA registry, but only 26% of country has submitted their NAMAs so far. In terms of the type of the NAMAs and regional group, we can see that Asia Pacific and the Latin American states are taking the lead in terms of submitting their NAMAs. And this year we have seen that NAMA seeking support for preparation and implementations are more or less equal in number, opposite to the last year. Last year, the more countries were willing to receive support for their preparation rather than the implementation. And the encouraging participation from states, African states, and NDCs is the highlight for this year as well. So all the NAMAs that has been recorded in the registry basically focused on the energy supply, residential and commercial buildings, and transport and infrastructure. And in terms of the energy supply, the focus of the countries were to implement energy efficiency technologies as well as generate electricity from through various renewable energy technologies such as solar, wind, bioenergy, hydropower, and cleaner fuels. So this slide shows that the variety or diversification in terms of sectoral and technology can be seen. This slide basically presents the supports requested by the countries in their NAMA records. We can see that the major part of the support required is as a financial support, followed by the technology and some of the capacity building. And you can find these supports disaggregated in terms of the support required for preparation and support required for the implementation, as well as in terms of the regional groups. And we have noticed that the major chunk of the support requested is for the implementation. And we can see that the major part of the requested support is for the financial support, and we try to look into what kind of financial support is country are looking for, and we have experienced that the most of the support requested is for the grant, and followed by the loans, guarantee, and we have also seen some instances of the intention to use the carbon financing and equity. And what were the major actions or mitigation programs they want to implement through these NAMAs? In terms of that question, we found that the most NAMAs are targeting for implementing national or sectoral level program or targets, and in addition to that, major NAMAs are also looking for investment in infrastructure and technology dissemination and machinery. And as I mentioned earlier, the total estimated cost for all NAMAs recorded so far till as of September 30, 2017, the total cost equivalent to the 28 billion, and they are requesting for the support equivalent to 11 billion. If you disaggregate this support requested in terms of financial, technological, and capacity building, we can see that the financial support requested is covers 9.3 billion. And till now, we have recorded the 18 sources of support in the NAMA registry, and through that support sources, we have also recorded 18 entries on support provided, which equivalents to the 37.7 million. But if you compare the support provided with the support required, we can see that there is a very huge gap between the demand and supply. But this recorded support at the moment is low, maybe the lower, because many countries or many support agencies might not have the reported the support they have provided. So that could be the another reason for the lower amount of support is recorded in the registry. But the general trend, looking at the general trend, we can conclude that there is a huge gap between the support requested and the support provided. So and these are the ways to connect to us. If you have any queries or any request for assistance in using the NAMA registry, or any queries or suggestion regarding the NAMA and NAMA registry, you can use these various communication means to reach out to us. And this is the link for our recent annual COP report, where we have provided much detailed information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gopal. And indeed, this is also what I wanted to say, that you can look into the documents for COP23, and you will definitely find the report on the NAMA registry, where all this information are available. In addition to that, the presentations that you have seen today will be posted on the web, so you will be again able to see the information. Now I will move, because I know that it's late, and we have presented many issues for you today. I will have the last presentation, and I will show you a little bit on the NDC registry, on the interim registry. As you know, we have the registry, the interim registry, already in place, and it doesn't go there. It doesn't go on the screen. It's still with this one. Or how did you go on the other one?
If you click the slide, so it goes.
No, it doesn't go. Somehow it doesn't go. We can't see it. We go directly from the close this one, close everything. Yeah, close all. Close this. And go from the one that I opened. There was the one like the Prezi, from my stuff. Yeah, that. You go directly on it. Click. It's okay, I think. Give full screen. It should show this one, and it doesn't.
Okay. I want to show this on.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to clone the screen, I think. Maybe this.
Now you can go on it. No, it was the other one. Okay, you can go on it. And go full screen. Okay, so now it's working. So a bit on the NDC registry. We have the mandate that was given by the party. No, it's with this one. You go with the arrows. The mandate that was given by the parties in the Paris Agreement. Articles 4.2 and 4.12 on how to prepare and to communicate the NDCs. And also this was followed by the decision 1 CP21, where the parties requested us to the SBI first of all to continue negotiations on how the registry will be established, and also to they asked the Secretariat to make available the interim registry. So this happened in 2016. Again. And currently, you will see if you look on the agenda that it is today in this session, you will find under the SBI agenda item 6, which is dealing with the negotiations for the establishment of the modalities and procedures for the NDC registry, for the final registry. You can see a bit on the timeline. We are now at SBI 47. We are still discussing it, but the expectation is that next year in December at the next COP, the SBI will be able to forward the modalities and procedures to the Conference of the Parties, to the Paris Agreement for adoption. So at this moment where we are, the parties managed to decide on the scope of work for the agenda item, for the negotiations, mainly to focus on the technical issues, to leave aside any other negotiation items that are under the APA agenda, for example, on the NDC, how the NDCs will be submitted, will be adjusted, and so on. So that's the main idea for the negotiations now, to look how the registry will function, what are the features, what is behind the NDC registry modalities and procedure, and to manage to focus the negotiations and to come up with the final modalities and procedure at the next COP. We had a call for submissions at the last SBI session in May. There were some submissions received, and based on this, the negotiations that are ongoing now are having a bit more on the substance. Next. One more. Now on the interim registry, because this is what we wanted to show you today. This is again what enables parties to communicate and record their NDCs, and this was, as mentioned, mandated in Paris. There are basically two parts of the NDC registry: the public landing page and the places where everybody can see what is going on, and the country page, which is specific for the parties, where they have access to a secured account, where they can submit and manage their documents for NDCs. We have revised, after the launching in May last year, we have revised it a little bit in October last year to be able to include some search functions and to make some small changes that were requested by parties. You can see on the link, this is the link to go directly to the NDC registry to see all the information that are provided officially by parties in real time. Regarding the features, as I have mentioned a little bit before, it's a web-based platform. We tried as much as possible to have a user-friendly operation. First of all, what is important also is that there were no guidance. The mandate was given to the Secretariat to think and to invent a place where it is easy for the parties to put NDCs, and this is what we did. But again, this is why there are now negotiations to finalize and to make the final registry as the parties want. The registry now is very flexible. We can allow different document types to be on the page. Mostly the parties put PDF or Word documents, and again, all the previous versions of the documents that are put there are available for public record. Stakeholders and the public has the possibility to search, read, and download all the information recorded in the registry. And very important, two items that were very important for the parties to make sure that their account is safe, that only the national focal points of the parties are allowed to enter into the registry and upload documents, and in the same time to make sure that there are some security measures put in place to avoid unauthorized access and the alteration of content. As you know, parties associate a great deal of importance to their NDCs, so it is very important to make sure that there is no alteration of content. A bit on the current procedure, parties are communicating their first NDCs. As you know, the process from Paris was for parties to communicate their NDCs prior or while joining the Paris Agreement. But you know, in that before there were the INDCs provided by all parties. So there was this process of automatically converting the INDCs into the NDCs, unless some parties that requested not to do that, and we have received several of this kind of requests. But in the same time, the process goes rather automatically for the parties, so we are uploading their INDCs as the first NDCs in the registry, and we inform the parties through their focal points. Again, if the parties request not to convert their INDCs, we have to be informed on that before the ratification, so not to proceed automatically on this, and we have the back and forth information with the party for them to provide their documents and to make sure that the right NDC is uploaded in the registry. This is how it looks like. We have different areas on it. It's not a very complex site. That was the idea from the very beginning, to have rather simple structure and look and feel. I think the most important here is the idea that all the NDCs are provided based on the country names, and you can see in the lower part. There is a counter. Now there are 169 NDCs, and there is a place for the parties to log in. And probably the most important, on top in the middle, is the idea to search NDCs by keywords or by party name. By keywords, it works in the same way as Google searches for keywords. So this is the simple registry that we have now. From the negotiations, from what we have heard in the last year and so since the negotiations started for the final NDC registry, parties are used already with the interim registry. They had we have received kind of good feedback from them in terms of functionality, in terms of security. So probably we will see most of these features in the final NDC registry. But again, this is an ongoing process. So parties now are thinking how this will look like. But again. Please follow the ongoing negotiations on the process, and we will see how this will end up. And this is only a graph to show you how we stand at this moment in terms of the NDCs, how many were automatically converted from INDCs to NDCs, and how many were revised or submitted, or parties that submitted new NDCs. And there are some of them that are in the process of revision. So currently we have, if I'm not mistaken, 169 NDCs that were in the NDC registry. That was all from my side. If you have any feedback or suggestions for us, we are ready to get them. We have somehow received this a full round of comments after we showed the first time the registry in May last year. We have improved it in October, but we are still collecting ideas. There was a kind of a internal decision not to make any more changes now into the interim registry, because the final registry will come probably at the end of next year. So we will have the final one, and we will have to work to make sure that we establish the final one. But still, it is important from us to get feedback from the parties, and from the public, from you, because all these technicalities can be brought forward into the final one. Thank you. If you have any questions in terms of the NAMA registry, the NDC registry, how they function, or for any of the panelists, we are ready to respond. Yes. Please.
May I ask you a quick question? As we go through the NDCs, will it become the registry for historical record, so you'll be able to see the different right the way through, and if there's a different version, so people still update, will that be a different part? Once it's in there, it doesn't come out again.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It is exactly at this time that parties are discussing how the records will be kept. How it is a linkage now with the APA negotiations that are ongoing, especially on agenda item 3 on mitigation, where all the NDCs are discussed, how to update, how to adjust, how to move on with the second round of NDCs. So this is also linked with the negotiations on the registry. So this is why this was exactly what the parties were discussing yesterday during the informal consultations of how to move on. This will be part of the features of the registry. So it is. I cannot comment more because this will be prejudging what the parties are doing now. But I can at least tell you that this is on the list of parties' views, how to make sure that the information is there.
Just in terms of transparency, it would be unfortunate if history was erased.
Yes, and I hope that the parties are also around to hear these views. Thank you. Yes.
That actually were linked with seeking support and getting funding. 18 entities, was that correctly understood? Has anybody of these 18 entities found each other through the registry, or was it already like through bilateral cooperation? It is just to have a view on that. Then I have one question for David Rogers. You had an impressive list of, was it 16 projects that was more or less coming to full implementation of the NAMAs? Have these reached a stage of where you are actually implemented and you are monitoring, and you have reached them to be part of the reporting of the poor reports or NCs and so on? And have you seen anything challenges in relation to that?
Yes, thank you for your questions. With regard to the matching, yes, we have the both examples for the matching which are found through the registry, or examples where they already had the process of providing or receiving support, or they are known to each other from the earlier, and later on they decided to put the information in the registry for the public consumption or information dissemination. Yes, so both ways it is working, yes.
Thank you for the question. The 23 projects that I mentioned have all been approved by the GEF Council in the last 3 years. For most of those projects, that means that they're just now in their first year of implementation. Most of our projects average 4 years. So I would expect that the annual reports from the projects are starting to roll in now. And then we'll get the midterm report in about 2 years, and then the final reports from those will be available over the next 5 years. I would say, though, that if you're interested in understanding the estimated emissions, mitigation emission benefits from the projects, we have those in hand right now. So if you're interested, give me your card. I'll send you a list of the projects, and we can already document their proposed mitigation ambition in terms of tons of carbon avoided or mitigated.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Any other questions? No. Then I will thank you for participating. I will also thank the panelists for coming and for the late hour. It is good again to see that we are reporting every year for the NAMAs and for the NDCs, and I hope that you will also come next year for our event. Thank you.